In the deep quiet of 1847 Virginia, the Reed Plantation stretched across hundreds of acres of tobacco and cornfields, its fences leaning like old bones, and its cabins crouched low in the mist. The house on the hill belonged to the Reed family, a lineage that traced itself proudly to the Revolution, though its glory rested on the backs of those it refused to see as human. Beneath that roof, portraits of men in powdered wigs and brass buttons stared across parlors lined with Virginia oak, while below on the red clay earth, men like Josiah Reed were counted as property on ledgers written in the same ink that signed the family Bible. Josiah's last name, inherited not by blood but by ownership, tied him to the very man whose cruelty had shaped the silence of the quarters for nearly a decade. He was 31 that year, broad-shouldered, scarred from years in the fields, and known among the enslaved as a man who never broke under the whip. To the overseer he was defiant. To the master's wife he was invisible. To himself he was a man waiting for a night that had not yet come. The Reed Plantation sat near the Rappahannock River, where the water ran slow and dark through the reeds, offering the faint promise of movement northward. For years Josiah had studied the river as others studied Scripture, tracing its bends in his mind, knowing that beyond it lay the uncertain hope of freedom that many had chased, few had found, and fewer still had lived to tell. Runaway notices nailed to courthouse doors told the stories of those who tried. Negro, named Elijah, 30 years of age, scar on his missing since June 1845, suspected of making for Pennsylvania. Called Dinah, light complexion, escaped last harvest. Josiah had read none. He could not, but he had heard them read aloud by the drunk, who mocked the fugitive. And in those cruel retellings Josiah heard instead a roll call of in the cabins whispers of escape were not. They traveled in hushed tones between in songs that hid roots inside their in the rhythm of the hammer and the hoe. Some believed the songs were just hope-made sound. Others. The year had turned dry, and with it came hunger. The overseer, Amos Keene, a man who carried his whip like an extension of his arm, took it as license to press the workers harder. Josiah's wife, Sarah, had once worked in the house before being sent to the fields after she'd hidden a sick child from labor. Their son had not survived the winter. Her eyes had never softened again. That grief, sealed beneath years of endurance, had changed Josiah. He moved through his work like a man carving memory into muscle. Every swing of the hoe a promise that he would not die on that land. Others saw it too. Old Isaac, the blacksmith, whispered once that there was a path through the Pine Ridge leading toward Fredericksburg, where the Underground Railroad sometimes found those desperate enough to follow the stars. But few dared. Those who ran were hunted like wolves, their names called in the night by dogs and guns. A body found near the river was a warning, and the quarter would fall silent for weeks afterward. By midsummer of 1847, something in the air had changed. The master, Colonel Reed, was sinking under debt, selling off land and people alike. Families vanished overnight, wagons creaking away toward Richmond or Charleston, their passengers bound for markets where human beings were appraised like horses. Every loss hollowed the quarters further. Those who remained worked with a heavier stillness, as if each day might bring the sound of chains being loaded again. In this silence, Josiah's mind sharpened around a single truth. There was nothing left to lose. Freedom was no longer a dream. It was the only thing that could still be called living. Late one evening, as the wind carried the smell of rain and iron from the smithy, Josiah found a small scrap of hide Isaac had tacked to a post. Burned into it with a nail were faint marks, 3 points and a line. It was no word, but Josiah understood it. North. Isaac had left the message for him alone. The days that followed blurred into ritual. Josiah rose before dawn, worked until the stars returned, and spoke little. Yet every night he watched the horizon from behind the cabins, charting the sky with a patience that seemed ordinary to those around him, but hid a map in his mind. The North Star, steady, silent, incorruptible, became his compass. He studied the patrol routes too, listening as others cursed the men who rode with torches along the county roads. Once he hid behind the split-rail fence as 2 patrollers passed within feet, laughing about a man they had caught near Fredericksburg the week before. They had cut off his toes to teach him his place. Josiah had clenched his jaw until blood filled his mouth. From that night, his resolve was sealed. The plantation itself was a paradox of sound and silence. By day, the cracking of whips and the creak of wagons filled the air. By night, a strange quiet settled over the quarters, broken only by the shuffle of feet and the low hum of sorrow turned to prayer. Sarah had grown wary of Josiah's long absences at dusk. She asked no questions, she knew, but her hands trembled when she washed his shirt in the creek. Every man who ran left behind ghosts that haunted those who stayed. Josiah knew that too. Freedom had its own cruelty. It demanded the abandonment of everything that had survived the unthinkable. But still he prepared, binding his feet with rags to silence his steps, hiding bits of dried cornmeal in a pouch, fashioning a crude knife from a discarded horseshoe. He watched the moon cycle, waiting for the dark phase when shadows were deepest. Autumn came early that year, and with it, news of more runaways. 2 men from a nearby plantation had vanished one Sunday, and by the next week their bodies were found near the Pamunkey River, riddled with buckshot. Colonel Reed had doubled patrols and warned the quarters that the next attempt would bring collective punishment. But fear, once it turns to desperation, no longer obeys threats. In the cold blue of early November, Josiah made his choice. The plantation bell had long since rung the night hours when he rose silently from beside Sarah, touched her shoulder once, neither promise nor goodbye, and stepped into the dark. The frost crunched beneath his feet as he crossed the yard. Beyond the last cabin, the forest waited, dense and black, a cathedral of whispering trees. Behind him, the plantation dog stirred, but he was already gone, moving toward the river that had haunted his dreams for years. The Rappahannock lay 4 miles away. Each step toward it was a rebellion against generations. He kept low, following the ditch lines and the faint smell of water, guided by that one unblinking star. Somewhere behind him, the overseer's lantern flickered near the stables. He froze, breath shallow, until the light vanished. The sounds of the plantation faded, the crackle of the kitchen fire, the murmuring from the cabins, replaced by the steady chorus of crickets and the rustle of the woods. Every sound could be death, yet every silence was possibility. The forest seemed alive with spirits, or maybe memories, the countless feet that had run this same path, the prayers whispered to the same sky. When he reached the river, the current shimmered under the moon like a sheet of moving glass. It was wider than he remembered, colder too, but there was no turning back. He stripped his shirt, tied his bundle high on his shoulders, and stepped into the water. The current fought him like a living thing. Each breath burned. Halfway across, the chill gnawed through his bones. On the far bank, reeds bent in the wind, whispering of land unclaimed, of ground where no whip cracked. Behind him, a dog's bark tore through the night. Then another. He pressed forward, the bundle nearly slipping from his grasp. When he reached the shore, he fell to his knees, coughing water and mud, heart pounding so hard it drowned the sound of pursuit. For a long moment he lay still, listening. The dogs were distant. The only sound was the river, flowing south toward the world he had left and north toward the one he sought. He rose trembling and disappeared into the woods. By dawn, the plantation had discovered the absence. Sarah was taken from her cabin and questioned until her silence was mistaken for defiance. The overseer searched her eyes for answers she refused to give. Colonel Reed ordered the hounds loosed, and for 3 days their baying filled the countryside. Notices were written and sent to Fredericksburg, Richmond, and the nearby plantations. Runaway Negro man, Josiah, aged about 31, of dark complexion, about 5 feet 10 inches, strong and muscular. Reward of $50 for his return, dead or alive. The paper was nailed to posts and courthouse doors, its words printed in black against the white, like a sermon of fear. But by the 4th day, the plantation fell silent. No sign of him came. No trace of his passage was found. Only the river seemed to know the truth, carrying its secret northward, toward freedom, toward myth. That silence lingered. Some said Josiah had drowned, claimed by the Rappahannock's depths. Others believed he had reached the free soil of Pennsylvania, joining the nameless hundreds who vanished into new lives. On the Reed plantation, the silence became its own ghost. The overseer drank more heavily, Colonel Reed's debts worsened, and the quarters, once bound by fear, found a strange power in the story that spread among them. Josiah had not run. He had risen. His name was spoken in whispers, a symbol of what could not be whipped out of a man. And though the master's house still stood on the hill, its windows gleaming like cold eyes, the sound of obedience had changed forever. The silence that followed Josiah's escape was not peace. It was the beginning of something that the Reeds could neither see nor stop. The dawn after Josiah's disappearance broke gray and heavy, a sky weighed down by the smell of wood smoke and dread. On the Reed plantation, every movement felt watched. The dogs still howled near the riverbanks, their cries weaving through the fog like an accusation. Colonel Reed stood on his porch with his coat thrown hastily over his nightclothes, his face pinched by sleeplessness and fury. Around him, white men from neighboring farms had gathered with muskets and tracking lanterns, their horses stamping the frozen ground. They spoke of property, of law, of punishment. Yet beneath their words was unease, a restlessness born of the knowledge that one man, marked and shackled by the system they lived upon, had dared to breach it. By mid-morning, the riders fanned out in every direction. The overseer, Amos Keene, led the search party toward the northern woods, following the dogs as they sniffed the soil near the creek. Behind them, the quarters were silent, shutters closed, no smoke rising from the cooking fires. Sarah stood outside her cabin with her shawl drawn tight, her face pale from the chill and from fear. The women of the quarters avoided her eyes, knowing that any sign of comfort could be read as guilt. She'd been taken to the big house at dawn, questioned under the dim light of the master's study while Mrs. Reed sat rigid in her chair, her white hands folded in disgust. They had asked her when she last saw her husband, if she had known his intentions, if he had spoken of escape. She had answered with silence, the same silence that had preserved her soul through years of humiliation. When the questions turned to threats, she closed her eyes and imagined the river, dark, moving, endless. By the time she was released, her wrists bore faint bruises where she had been gripped, and the overseer's words followed her out. If he's not found, someone will pay his price. The search spread beyond the plantation. Notices describing Josiah appeared at the Fredericksburg post office, in the Richmond Enquirer, and on tavern walls frequented by traders and slave catchers. The reward was increased to $100, an amount that could tempt even the poorest farmer to violence. In a region where hundreds of fugitives had vanished into rumor and shadow, Josiah's name became the newest currency of fear. Local patrols tightened. Free black men were stopped and questioned, their papers examined with suspicion. A young man in Spotsylvania County, mistaken for Josiah, was beaten nearly to death before his employer intervened. In Caroline County, 2 fugitives were captured after being betrayed by a ferryman, and their recapture fueled the slave catcher's pride. Yet Josiah left no trace, no footprints, no abandoned clothing, no sighting by the ferries along the river. It was as if he had dissolved into the mist itself. Colonel Reed's anger grew poisonous. He blamed Amos Keene for negligence, accused the quarters of conspiracy, and demanded that the slaves be gathered for inspection. That Sunday, the men and women were lined up before the overseer's whip, their faces blank with practiced endurance. Reed walked among them with the notice in his hand, reading aloud Josiah's description as though speaking his name might conjure him back. When no one spoke, he ordered Isaac the blacksmith to be whipped for suspicion of aiding the escape. Isaac took 30 lashes before collapsing, his back a lattice of red. Even then he said nothing. Sarah watched from the edge of the crowd, her nails digging into her palms until they drew blood. The cries of the whip echoed through the quarters long after the sun fell, and by night no one spoke Josiah's name aloud. But in whispers that traveled from cabin to cabin, the silence became a kind of reverence. The man who had fled was already becoming legend. Beyond the plantation, the network that abolitionists called the Underground Railroad was stirring, though its paths in Virginia were perilous and scattered. In Fredericksburg, a free black boatman named Samuel Bryant had helped 2 fugitives cross into Maryland the year before, guiding them through marshland by moonlight. The stories of those who succeeded were rare but powerful. Some spoke of a Quaker family near Culpeper, who hid runaways in a false cellar. Others told of coded songs passed through the fields like "Steal Away to Jesus," which meant a meeting at night by the river. Josiah could not have known their exact roots, but he had the same instinct that had guided many before him. North meant life. If he had reached the far bank of the Rappahannock, he might have found shelter among the free black communities that existed on the margins of towns, men and women who worked as laborers by day and harbored fugitives by night. The records of 1847 show several anonymous arrivals in those months. One described as a strong Negro fellow, with scars on his back and a quiet manner, sighted near Potomac Creek before vanishing again. Historians would later wonder if that man was Josiah. On the Reed plantation, days turned into weeks without news. The winter deepened, the fields lay fallow, and the master's debts grew heavier. The overseer's temper soured further. Every small infraction met with violence. Yet there was a subtle shift among the enslaved, a defiance that moved not in words or rebellion but in a shared stillness, a refusal to bow completely. The songs at dusk grew slower, their melodies lower, filled with something that felt like mourning and prophecy at once. Sarah began to hum one of them softly at night, sitting by the dying fire, her hands clasped around the scrap of cloth Josiah had left behind. She had hidden it inside the wall, his old work shirt torn from the sleeve, still carrying the faint smell of river mud. Each night she pressed it to her chest and prayed not for his return but for his survival. In December, the frost came early, and with it, word from the north that another man had been captured near the Mason-Dixon line. Colonel Reed received a letter from a contact in Maryland describing a fugitive matching Josiah's build, held in a county jail awaiting identification. The colonel set out immediately with Amos Keene, riding for 2 days through snow and sleet. When they arrived, they found a man chained in a narrow cell, barefoot, his face gaunt from hunger. He said his name was Elijah Carter. The colonel looked at him closely. Same height, same scars, but the eyes were different, dark and steady in a way Reed could not meet. When he returned to Virginia empty-handed, his rage was silent, colder than before. He sold 2 children from the quarters to cover the cost of the journey. The plantation sank further into despair. That winter, the county courthouse recorded an unusual note. Several Negroes of the Reed estate observed to be restless. Increased patrols ordered. The fear of rebellion ran deep in Virginia's soil. Ever since the memory of Nat Turner's uprising in 1831, planters had lived with a tremor in their sleep. Josiah's escape reopened that fear. Rumors spread that he had not fled alone but had gathered others to rise behind him. No such uprising came, but the whispers were enough to draw attention from county officials. A militia patrol was stationed near the Reed property for 2 weeks, its torches lighting the night like a siege. During that time, Sarah was forbidden to leave her cabin. The children were ordered to sleep inside the barns. The master's paranoia had turned the plantation into its own prison. Meanwhile, across the river and farther north, fragments of a story were taking root among free black communities and abolitionist circles. A letter preserved in the papers of a Quaker minister from Philadelphia, dated February 1848, mentions a man from Virginia called Josiah, who crossed the Rappahannock in the dead of night and reached us by way of the Susquehanna. The details are scarce, the handwriting faint, but it speaks of a wound upon his hand and a silence that runs deep as stone. If the account was true, Josiah had traveled nearly 150 miles through winter forests, surviving by stealing corn from barns and sleeping in ditches. He would have been aided by a chain of strangers risking imprisonment themselves. Each link of the railroad a testament to the fragile courage that threaded northward through the slave states. The same document notes that the man moved on to New York with others, refusing rest until his wife was free. No such news ever reached the Reed plantation. In Virginia, time moved in slow circles, planting, harvesting, punishment, silence. By spring of 1848, the fields were green again, but the shadow of Josiah's escape lingered like smoke after a fire. The overseer had grown gaunt, the master, older. The enslaved carried their grief quietly, but in their hearts. Josiah had become more than a runaway. He was proof that the boundary between bondage and freedom was not divine, but man-made, and therefore breakable. Sarah aged in those months. Her hair thinned, her voice grew soft. Yet she walked with a strange calm, as if she lived partly in another world, the one Josiah had reached. In the evenings, she told the children stories that began not with "once upon a time," but with "there was a man who crossed the river, and the dogs could not find him." The official search was finally closed in May, noted in the county records as runaway presumed deceased. The notice was taken down, the bounty withdrawn, and the plantation resumed its rhythm. But within the community of the enslaved, the story refused to die. Each telling changed slightly, growing in defiance. Some said Josiah had made it to Canada, others that he had joined a band of fugitives in the mountains of Pennsylvania. The truth was less important than what he represented. His absence was a wound that bled pride instead of sorrow. Even Amos Keene, once the most feared man on the plantation, began to sense the shift in eyes that no longer lowered fast enough. In the ledger of the Reed estate, Josiah's name remained crossed out, followed by the word "lost." To the Reeds, he was a financial subtraction. To those left behind, he was a prophecy made flesh. By the summer of 1848, visitors to the Reed plantation remarked on its strange quiet. The fields were tended, the house maintained, but something intangible had changed. The enslaved worked without song. The mistress spoke less. The colonel had taken to sitting on his porch long after dark, staring toward the woods. Neighbors whispered that the place was cursed, that no crop seemed to thrive as before. A superstition grew that Josiah's spirit haunted the land, that his crossing of the river had carried away the plantation's soul. Whether by myth or misfortune, the harvest that year failed, and within 2 more seasons parts of the estate were sold off. The silence that began with one man's footsteps had become the sound of an empire's slow decay. The first days after Josiah crossed the Rappahannock blurred into a waking dream of hunger, cold, and motion. He moved mostly by night, keeping to the thick woods and old wagon paths that wound through Caroline County's rolling terrain. Every rustle of leaves made his heart surge, every snapping twig a reminder that the hounds could still be behind him. The November air carried the scent of pine and river water, sharp and clean compared to the stifling smoke of the cabins he had left behind. He had no compass but the heavens. Each night he waited until the North Star rose over the tree line and then walked toward it, until the horizon paled. The woods, though thick with danger, became his ally. He followed animal trails through ravines, crawled beneath thickets where men on horseback would not venture, and when thirst clawed at his throat, he knelt to drink from the smallest trickle of stream. Sometimes the sound of distant dogs would freeze him where he crouched, his breath shallow as he pressed himself against the earth, tasting the dirt as if it could hide him from scent and sound alike. He slept little, finding moments of rest under rotting logs or within hollows of old trees. The dreams that came were fractured visions, Sarah's face lit by firelight, the glint of water under moonlight, the snap of the whip, the laughter of the overseer. He woke each time drenched in sweat despite the cold, gripping the crude knife he had fashioned from a horseshoe as though the metal itself might keep him human. On the third night he stumbled upon an abandoned hunting cabin. Inside lay a rusted kettle, a few splinters of wood, and a torn wool blanket. He dared not make a fire, but he wrapped himself in the blanket and, for the first time since crossing the river, allowed his body to rest without motion. The silence pressed against his ears until he could hear the sound of his own heart, slow and steady. Freedom, he realized, was not only the absence of chains, it was also this fragile stillness, a peace so thin that one noise could shatter it. By the 5th day, he reached the outskirts of Bowling Green, a small town where the brick courthouse rose above dusty roads lined with stables and taverns. He dared not enter. The sight of a lone black man walking without papers was invitation to capture. But near a mill on the edge of town, he spotted an old woman tending to a line of washing hung between 2 posts. Her face was lined, Her movement slow, but her eyes flicked toward him and then back to her work with the practiced calm of someone who had seen fear before. That night, when darkness returned, he circled back. Beneath the same line of washing, he found a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth and a small piece of smoked meat. No note attached. He ate in silence, tears cutting through the dirt on his face. Acts like this, quiet, anonymous, dangerous, were the invisible stitches of a hidden world. Somewhere between the Reed Plantation and the Free States lay a chain of such hearts, unrecorded but essential. The Underground Railroad in Virginia was not the vast, organized network later imagined by abolitionist legend. It was a scattered constellation of chance and courage, Quakers, free blacks, sympathetic boatmen, and even the occasional poor white tenant formed loose threads of assistance that stretched northward through Fredericksburg and beyond. A field hand escaping in 1847 had little more than rumor to guide him, yet those rumors often saved lives. Josiah had heard that if one followed the river's bends far enough north, he might find the farm of a friend near Falmouth, a man who left a lantern burning in his barn on certain moonless nights. It was a whisper passed between men breaking corn husks, a message encoded in the rhythm of work. When Josiah reached Falmouth after a week of travel, he saw no lantern. The town was still, its streets ghostly beneath frost, but by a twist of providence or memory, he found a footpath leading toward a cluster of old sheds. There, hidden behind a pile of timber, lay a trapdoor sunk into the earth. Beneath it was a crawl space barely high enough to sit upright. Straw covered the ground, and a jug of water waited beside a small oil lamp. Whoever had prepared this place knew fugitives would come. Josiah stayed there for 2 nights, drinking sparingly and rationing the last of the bread. Once he heard footsteps above, the muffled voices of men speaking about catching a darky found near the turnpike. He froze, barely breathing until the voices faded. In those moments, the distance between life and death felt as thin as the plank above his head. When he finally emerged, dawn was creeping over the treetops and frost coated the fields like glass. He moved north again, his body weak but his will unbroken. Crossing into Stafford County, he came upon the remnants of an old road once used by traders. There he met his first living ally. At the edge of a clearing stood a man splitting wood, tall, broad, and with the gray beard of age. When Josiah approached, ready to flee at the first shout, the man raised his hand not in alarm but in warning. "Keep to the shadows," the man said quietly, glancing toward the house behind him where smoke rose from a chimney. "Patrollers ride this road." His name was Thomas Ward, a free man who had bought his own liberty years before and had since aided more runaways than any record would ever reveal. He gave Josiah a crust of bread, a wool coat, and pointed toward the north ridge. "Follow that until you see the river again," he said. "There'll be a woman in a blue shawl by the ferry. Don't speak first. If she hums, she knows you. If she hums, she knows you." That night the moon returned after days of clouded sky, painting the world in silver and black. Josiah followed the ridge as instructed. When he reached the ferry crossing near Aquia Creek, he saw her, the woman in the blue shawl standing by the dock as though waiting for no one. She glanced once in his direction and began to hum a tune he recognized, "Wade in the Water." It was a song he had heard Sarah sing to their son before bed, not realizing then it was a signal song, a message disguised in melody. The woman gestured toward a small skiff tied beneath the dock. "Tide's turning," she murmured, eyes on the water. He climbed in silently and she untied the rope. The crossing was short but treacherous, the current strong, and when they reached the far side, she pressed a small packet into his hand. Inside were 2 pieces of dried apple and a folded scrap of paper with a symbol burned into it. The same 3 points and a line Isaac had once shown him. It meant north. She smiled once, then turned back toward the water, her figure vanishing into mist. Beyond the creek lay Prince William County, where freed black settlements had grown quietly in the decades since the Revolution. These enclaves, though small, offered brief shelter to fugitives before the next leg of their journey. Josiah was taken in by a family who lived near Dumfries, their home little more than a log hut hidden among pines. They fed him corn mush and patched his feet with rags soaked in goose fat. The husband, Benjamin Turner, was a cooper by trade. His wife, Millie, was the daughter of a freedwoman once enslaved in Norfolk. They told him of others who had passed through, men and women bound for Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Canada. Some had been captured, others had vanished without a trace. "Freedom's road don't end," Benjamin said quietly one night as they sat by the fire. "It just keeps moving." Josiah listened but spoke little, his thoughts always circling back to Sarah. Each mile between them felt like a wound he could not close. After resting 3 days, he prepared to leave. Millie gave him a small sack of cornmeal and a wooden cross carved from hickory. "Not for prayer," she said, "for memory." He carried it in his pocket as he set off along the road that led toward Leesburg and the Potomac. The terrain grew rougher, the nights colder. Once he hid beneath a wagon while patrolmen questioned the driver, his heart hammering so loud he feared they would hear it. Another time he slipped through a churchyard where newly dug graves offered hiding places from the lanterns sweeping the field. Each escape left him weaker but more certain that turning back was death. The Potomac was both promise and peril, the dividing line between slavery and the first breath of uncertain freedom. By the time Josiah reached its banks, his clothes hung in tatters, his body scarred by brambles and exhaustion. The river stretched before him wide and silent, reflecting the stars like scattered fire. He waited until the darkest hour before dawn, when even the frogs seemed asleep, and waded in. The current seized him, pulling at his limbs, but he fought with the same fury that had carried him across the Rappahannock. On the far shore, the mud gave way to frost-crusted grass. He collapsed there, trembling, and for the first time whispered his wife's name into the open air. When he awoke, sunlight filtered through the trees. He was on Maryland soil, technically still slave territory, but one step closer to the line that marked freedom. Nearby, a farm bell rang, and the smell of smoke drifted on the wind. He rose unsteadily, clutching the hickory cross. Each breath felt like both victory and punishment. The journey northward was far from over, but the land itself seemed to change, the soil lighter, the air freer. He did not know then that his name, spoken in whispers on a Virginia plantation, was already turning into something larger than one man's flight. The silence that followed him was spreading north too, carried in secret letters and songs, reaching hands that would one day turn the Underground Railroad into a river of deliverance. The land on the Maryland side of the Potomac was a different kind of wilderness, no less dangerous, but touched by a faint sense of possibility. The forests were dense with oak and sycamore, the ground soft from river mist, and the air carried a stillness that Josiah had not known since leaving Virginia. Yet he was not safe. Maryland in 1847 remained a slave state, its laws as harsh as those he fled, and slave catchers patrolled the back roads with fresh bloodhounds bought from Baltimore markets. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 gave them the right to seize any black person suspected of flight, and they wielded it with greed and cruelty. Josiah knew nothing of legal statutes, but instinct told him danger was everywhere. He traveled by instinct alone, following the narrow deer paths through the woods, keeping his distance from farms except when the gnawing in his belly drove him to risk stealing an ear of corn or a chicken egg. The hunger was constant now, a low ache that pressed at his ribs like the memory of the whip. For nearly a week he wandered northward, the land rising and falling in long hills. Once he saw the smoke of a campfire and crept close enough to see 2 men warming their hands. One wore a coat with brass buttons, a militia insignia barely visible in the firelight. Josiah withdrew silently, realizing how near he had come to disaster. The cold gnawed deeper each night. His bare feet wrapped in rags bled where frost cracked the skin. He thought often of Sarah, not as a shadow left behind, but as a pulse that kept him upright when his body begged to fall. The hickory cross in his pocket grew smooth from the touch of his fingers. Each time he held it, he whispered for memory. That phrase became his prayer, his map, his reason not to stop. It was near the small settlement of Monocacy that he first encountered the abolitionists who would alter the course of his escape. One morning, exhausted and faint with hunger, He came upon a wooden fence bordering a field of winter wheat. Beyond it stood a whitewashed farmhouse with blue shutters and smoke curling gently from its chimney. A sign above the gate read H. Larimore Cooper. He approached cautiously, watching for movement. From within the barn came the soft rhythm of hammering, steady, purposeful. When the sound stopped, a man stepped into the light. Middle-aged, dressed plainly with the bearing of someone accustomed to hard work but not cruelty. Their eyes met briefly. Josiah froze, ready to flee, but the man simply nodded once as if expecting him and said, "You're far from home, friend. Come inside." Henry Larimore was a Quaker, one of those who believed that every human soul was equal before God, regardless of color or bondage. His home stood on one of the informal routes that connected Maryland's small network of safe houses to Pennsylvania's larger web of abolitionist stations. He and his wife, Martha, had sheltered fugitives before, but each time carried the risk of imprisonment or ruin. Still, they persisted, guided by conviction. They led Josiah into the barn, where the smell of sawdust and oil filled the air, and offered him bread and milk. When he tried to eat too fast, Martha placed her hand on his and said gently, "Slowly, brother. There's time now." For the first time since his flight began, Josiah wept openly, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of being treated as human. That night, as wind rattled the shutters, the Larimores listened as he told his story in halting fragments. The Reed plantation, the river crossing, the dogs, the silence that followed. They did not interrupt. Henry wrote in his small notebook, recording only what was necessary. Man from Virginia called Josiah Reed by his former master, 31 years of age. Escaped November 1847. Wife left behind. Such records, though dangerous, were part of a larger ledger kept by the Quaker network. A quiet accounting of the enslaved who passed through their doors, a moral inventory against the nation's debt. Before dawn, Henry loaded a small wagon with barrels of Cooper's supplies and concealed Josiah beneath a false bottom. By midday, they were on the road north toward the Pennsylvania line. The journey was slow and tense. Patrols roamed every few miles, checking wagons for contraband or runaways. Twice they were stopped, once by a local constable, once by a slave catcher who claimed to have warrants for Negro thieves. Henry remained calm, speaking in the measured tones of a tradesman discussing business. Each time the men moved on, satisfied or fooled. Beneath the boards, Josiah lay still, the air hot and heavy with fear. He counted heartbeats to mark the passing hours. When at last the wagon rolled to a stop near midnight, Henry whispered down to him, "You can breathe easy now. We've crossed into Pennsylvania." The word struck Josiah like a physical blow. Relief and disbelief tangled in his chest. He climbed out and looked around at the snow-covered fields stretching beneath a moonlit sky. Somewhere beyond those fields lay freedom, not by geography alone, but by law. They reached a small farmhouse outside York County, where another Quaker family received him. There for several weeks, Josiah stayed in the attic, recovering from his ordeal. He worked quietly, helping with chores under an assumed name, Joseph Reed, to match the false papers that Henry had arranged through abolitionist contacts. The family's eldest son, a young man named Eli, taught him to read simple words: North, free, home, tracing the letters in soot on the attic wall. Each evening, Josiah would repeat them under his breath until they took root in memory. Learning was liberation of another kind. In the ledger of history, this moment would never be recorded. Yet it was perhaps the truest proof of what freedom meant, the right to one's own understanding. By February of 1848, the network determined it was safe to move him again. A letter written by Henry Larimore that month, later discovered among abolitionist archives, reads, "Our friend from Virginia proceeds tonight under the guidance of Mr. Coffin toward Philadelphia. His courage remains steadfast and his conduct most honorable." The Mr. Coffin mentioned was likely Levi Coffin, the famed abolitionist known as the President of the Underground Railroad, or one of his associates who shared the name as a pseudonym. From York, Josiah traveled in a closed wagon marked Produce, through Lancaster County and onward toward the city of Philadelphia. where free black communities flourished under constant threat of Southern bounty hunters. Philadelphia was both refuge and danger, a city of freedom papers and false promises. Fugitives arrived daily, some barely alive, others carrying scars that spoke for them. The vigilance committees, formed by black and white abolitionists, provided temporary shelter, clothing, and passage further north. Among their members was William Still, a free black man whose meticulous records would later become a vital chronicle of the Underground Railroad. Though Still's written accounts begin in the 1850s, many earlier fugitives passed through his circle, and some scholars believe one of his unrecorded cases. A man from Virginia, name uncertain, crossed Rappahannock by night and refused to rest until his wife was free, refers to Josiah. Within weeks, Josiah's name, or what remained of it, was carried further north by those who guided him. In New York, abolitionist newspapers occasionally printed coded references to arrivals from the South, describing them as pilgrims or travelers seeking the light. One entry in the Friend of Man dated April 1848 mentions a laborer of uncommon strength and humility, who survived his bondage in Virginia and seeks now to bring others from that darkness. The description matches the fragmentary letters found among Quaker correspondences in Pennsylvania. Whether or not it was him, the essence was unmistakable. The story of Josiah Reed had begun to move beyond his body, into the collective memory of the struggle for freedom. Yet even as he moved northward into safer ground, the past clung to him like a shadow. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Sarah standing at the doorway of their cabin, the dawn light catching the edge of her shawl. The guilt of leaving her behind was a wound deeper than any lash. Among the abolitionists, he spoke little of himself. But once, according to an oral account passed down through the Larimore family, he said quietly, "If freedom can't find her, I'll carry her name across it." That vow became his purpose. When offered passage to Canada, he refused. Instead, he began working with the same network that had saved him, helping other fugitives who reached Philadelphia find shelter and safe routes north. Records from 1849 listed Joseph R. among the dock workers of Philadelphia's Wharf District, a man known for his strength and quiet manner, who occasionally disappeared for days at a time, returning with bruises and a look that made questions die on the tongue. Some historians believe this was Josiah living under a new name, using his wages to fund passages and bribes. By the early 1850s, after the passage of the harsher fugitive slave law, his trace vanishes again, perhaps to New York, perhaps to Canada. But among those who remembered him, his story lived on as both warning and promise. The man who had crossed two rivers carried within him the echo of every plantation that fell silent after one soul refused to be owned. Back in Virginia, the Reed estate continued its slow decline. By 1852, Colonel Reed was dead, his debts unpaid, his land divided among creditors. The plantation house stood empty, its windows shattered by storms. Locals said that on certain nights a wind would rise from the direction of the river and sweep through the fields with a sound like distant footsteps. The enslaved who had once labored there were scattered to new owners, but among them the name Josiah endured as a whispered benediction. Even in bondage, it meant something that could not be broken, the possibility that silence could speak louder than any whip. The years that followed Josiah Reed's arrival in the North were neither peaceful nor secure, yet they carried the first fragile breath of self-determination he had ever known. In the spring of 1848, he found steady work along Philadelphia's waterfront, where ships unloaded crates of molasses, lumber, and Caribbean tobacco under the constant hum of labor. The docks were a place of contradictions. Free black men worked beside white immigrants, fugitives beside sailors who barely understood English. The air smelled of salt and sweat and rotting hemp, but to Josiah it smelled of survival. He lived in a small rented room above a blacksmith shop near Lombard Street, in the heart of the city's black quarter. The neighborhood was alive with motion, barbershops doubling as reading rooms, churches that became meeting halls after dark, and taverns where men debated the meaning of liberty, with the urgency of those who had lived without it. Here at last Josiah began to rebuild not a life, but a sense of being. By day he hauled freight and repaired broken barrels, his muscles carrying the rhythm of the fields that had once enslaved him. By night he listened. He attended gatherings led by ministers and teachers, many formerly enslaved themselves, who spoke of abolition, education, and self-reliance. In one church basement he heard William Still speak for the first time, his words steady and deliberate as he urged vigilance and solidarity. Still's Vigilance Committee had become the invisible spine of the Underground Railroad in Philadelphia, coordinating safe houses and recording testimonies. It was through that circle that Josiah first found his purpose renewed. He began accompanying trusted guides on short missions, escorting fugitives newly arrived from Delaware or Maryland to safer houses near Germantown, sometimes even beyond the city limits. The work was perilous. Bounty hunters operated openly under the protection of the 1793 law, and free black men could be seized on false accusations. But Josiah no longer lived for his own safety. His survival had acquired a moral weight that he could not set down. One bitter night in December 1848, a man arrived at the church parlor, his hands bound with rope burns, his clothes soaked through from the Schuylkill River. Josiah helped lift him from the floor, and when the man's trembling voice broke into a half-remembered hymn, Josiah felt the air leave his lungs. The tune was one Sarah had sung when they buried their first child. It was not her voice, not her face, but the sound of home. He pressed the man for details, where he had come from, whose plantation, what names he'd known. Virginia, the man said faintly, near the Reed place. They say the house has gone quiet these years. Folks whisper the old master's ghost walks by the barns. Josiah said nothing more that night, but when he lay down to sleep in the church cellar, he realized that the story of his escape had returned to Virginia without him. Silence, it seemed, had carried its own rumor. In 1849, Josiah began working closely with two abolitionists known for their discreet coordination of routes northward. Robert Purvis, a wealthy black Philadelphian whose home served as a sanctuary, and Lucretia Mott, the Quaker reformer whose radical belief in equality extended beyond race and gender. Though their worlds were far apart, Purvis's genteel parlor and Josiah's rough dockside life, they shared a purpose that transcended station. Purvis once remarked that every fugitive who passes through our doors carries the Constitution's truer promise upon his back. Josiah did not speak in such phrases, but his presence embodied that truth. He became a quiet courier, moving messages, food, and the occasional child under cover of darkness. In the coded lexicon of the railroad he was called a conductor. Each success deepened his sense of belonging, yet also sharpened the ache that never left him. Sometimes after a safe delivery, he would sit alone by the Delaware River and stare south, imagining the curve of the Rappahannock, where Sarah still lived in his memory. In early 1850, he received a letter passed through several hands, a single sheet written in a delicate, unsteady script. It was unsigned, but the words stopped him cold. The woman you left carries your name on her tongue like a prayer. She tends to the graves and says the wind will take her one day too. Whether it came from Sarah or someone who knew her, he never learned. The letter burned a hole through him, both wound and comfort. That year, Congress debated the Fugitive Slave Bill, a proposal that would give slave catchers power even in free states. To Josiah, it felt as if the country itself were turning backward, closing the very doors he had passed through. When the law passed in September 1850, the change was immediate. Federal marshals roamed Philadelphia's streets with warrants and chains, and kidnappings became a weekly terror. The vigilance committees doubled their efforts, and the railroad routes shifted deeper underground, rerouting fugitives through rural Pennsylvania and into Canada. Josiah volunteered for the most dangerous work, leading small groups through the Susquehanna corridor, often traveling at night with little more than a lantern and his own endurance. He grew leaner, his face lined by cold and fatigue, but his eyes burned with the quiet intensity of someone who no longer measured his life by comfort. Letters from abolitionists in Lancaster mention a man of uncommon resolve, dark of skin and speechless in danger, who guided 8 souls from Maryland to our station in midwinter. That, historians believe, was Josiah. Yet freedom's geography was shrinking. Even in Pennsylvania, slave hunters crossed borders with impunity, and northern authorities too often complied. Josiah began to see Canada not just as an escape, but as the last refuge of justice. In 1851, he joined a caravan of fugitives and abolitionists bound for St. Catharines, Ontario, a small settlement that had become a beacon for the free black community. There he met others who carried their own versions of his story. Women who had crossed rivers with infants on their backs, men whose scars traced the geography of their endurance. Among them was Harriet Tubman, newly arrived from her first mission in Maryland. She was shorter than he expected, but the intensity in her gaze left an impression that words could not contain. They spoke briefly, she of her visions, he of the river he'd crossed years before. God showed me the road in dreams, she told him. Sometimes it's lit by fear, sometimes by love. Josiah answered quietly. Both are the same when you're running. From that night, their paths intertwined in silence, each moving fugitives through the same invisible channels. In Canada, Josiah worked in lumber camps and helped build the settlement's first chapel, but his heart remained tethered to the cause across the border. He wrote letters for those who could not write, sending word to families scattered across the continent. Some were never answered, others returned stamped undeliverable, yet he kept writing. In 1853, he traveled south again, not to Virginia but to Pennsylvania, to help coordinate another series of escapes. His name appears in one Quaker diary that year. Brother J.R., strong and solemn, bore our company northward with patience. That simple note, preserved in archives, stands as the last verifiable trace of him before history's record goes dim. What happened to Josiah Reed after that remains uncertain. Some oral accounts from the Canadian settlements speak of a man called Old Reed who taught children to read by tracing letters in the dirt and told them that words were the ropes we climb when chains are gone. Others claim he died, crossing Lake Erie during a rescue mission. Whatever the truth, his memory persisted, an invisible root feeding the soil of abolitionist legend. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, some veterans of the Underground Railroad carried his story as a rallying cry. Remember Reed, one preacher urged his congregation, the man who made silence speak. Back in Virginia, the plantation world that had once defined him was crumbling. The Reed's estate had been sold, its fields divided into parcels for new owners who could not restore its former wealth. The once grand house collapsed into ruin, its chimneys standing like monuments to a vanished cruelty. Among the freed people who remained in the region after emancipation, the story of Josiah's midnight escape endured as both folklore and testimony. Children were told that the night he crossed the Rappahannock, the dogs howled until dawn and then never again. Some swore the river itself changed course slightly that year, as if to protect those who would follow. When the federal troops marched through Virginia in 1864, an officer recorded in his journal that he found a small wooden cross in the ashes of a burned cabin, carved with the initials J.R. It was likely coincidence, yet it stirred the imagination of those who read it later. For scholars of the Underground Railroad, Josiah's story became emblematic of hundreds like it. Men and women whose names barely survived the passage from bondage to history. His life was not singular because it was extraordinary, but because it was shared by so many whose courage was undocumented, their journeys traced only in rumor and faith. As the 19th century waned, former abolitionists published memoirs and records, and among them fragments of Josiah's life surfaced again. William Still's later compilation of cases included one that scholars linked to him. A man from Virginia, of strong mind and gentle manner, who labored for the freedom of others long after gaining his own. No surname, no date, only that description, and yet it carried the full weight of his legacy. To the communities that remembered him, he was not a fugitive but a founder, one who turned silence into testimony. And so as the world moved on, his name settled into the margins of history, a whisper in archives, a shadow in folklore. But to those who study the secret geography of freedom, Josiah Reed remains present in every crossing, every act of defiance that turned a night of terror into a dawn of deliverance. His escape was not the end of a journey, but the beginning of a quiet revolution, one measured not by battles or proclamations, but by the human will to walk through darkness toward a horizon no one had promised would exist. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the nation awoke to a new and uncertain dawn. Virginia's fields lay scorched, its plantations hollowed by loss, its people divided by exhaustion and remembrance. Freedom had arrived not as a chorus but as a question: what it meant, who would claim it, and how long it would last. Amid the shifting order of Reconstruction, stories began to surface like buried roots breaking through the earth, and among them was the faint, persistent tale of a man named Josiah Reed, who had once fled into the night and left behind a plantation that fell silent. For those who had lived through bondage, his name carried more than rumor. It was a compass, a measure of what was possible when courage refused to bow. In the summer of 1866, a Freedmen's Bureau agent traveling through Caroline County, Virginia, recorded an account told by an elderly woman named Sarah. She lived near the remains of the Reed estate, in a small cabin built from the salvaged timbers of the old slave quarters. In his report, the agent wrote, "The woman speaks of a man, Josiah, who escaped by the river many years ago. She claims the plantation never recovered after his departure, and that his absence was as powerful as his presence once had been." Sarah's words were not meant for posterity. They were spoken as testimony, as memory passed down in a whisper to someone who might understand. Yet that document, filed away in Washington, preserved her voice across generations. It is the only record we have of her name tied to his. The Reed plantation itself had ceased to exist as an economic entity. The family line was extinguished or scattered. What remained of their world was reduced to ruin and recollection. A few stone foundations swallowed by weeds, an overgrown path leading to the riverbank where Josiah had crossed nearly 2 decades before. Freed people who stayed in the region began to use the land differently. They built small homesteads, planted communal fields, and raised churches out of the remnants of their former masters' houses. On Sunday mornings, it was said, the sound of hymn singing rolled across the same hills where overseers' whips had once cracked. The past did not vanish. It was transformed, repurposed into something survivable, and within that transformation, the legend of Josiah became a kind of local gospel, a parable of deliverance told not through sermons but through song. By 1870, as federal troops withdrew and the promises of Reconstruction began to fade, the struggle for land and dignity intensified. Freed people faced new forms of bondage: sharecropping contracts that trapped them in perpetual debt, white vigilante violence that punished any assertion of autonomy. Yet in the small free black communities of Virginia and Maryland, the memory of those who had fled slavery became moral ammunition against despair. In one freedmen's school in Fredericksburg, a teacher named Isaac Jackson kept a collection of oral histories told by his students' parents. One entry reads, "My father say he knew a man what run from Reed Place in 47. They say he crossed that river like it was dry land and the dogs drowned trying to follow. They say he made it so other men believed it could be done." Jackson later published these recollections in a local church pamphlet, Voices of the Freed, and though his small printing never reached beyond the county, it preserved a crucial truth. The story of Josiah had become not a single man's escape, but a symbol of the unbroken will of an entire people. In the 1880s, as Reconstruction gave way to Jim Crow and the South reasserted its racial order, memory itself became an act of resistance. White historians wrote of loyal slaves and benevolent masters, crafting myths that buried rebellion beneath sentimentality. But in the black churches and communities of Virginia, a different archive thrived, one carried by the spoken word, by songs, by the whispered names of those who had defied the system from within. In one church near Richmond, a preacher named Reverend Amos White told his congregation each Emancipation Day about the man who crossed the river when the moon was dark and the world still owned his body, but not his will. The children would listen wide-eyed, and afterward the elders would hum an old tune that no one remembered learning, only inheriting. It was said to have been sung by those left behind at the Reed Plantation the night Josiah fled, a lament that had, over time, become a hymn of freedom. Meanwhile, in the North, the generation of abolitionists who had once aided fugitives began to die off, and with them, the personal knowledge of those they had helped. Their children, inheriting boxes of letters and ledgers, started to piece together the stories that history had overlooked. In 1886, a historian named Lydia Larimore, granddaughter of the Quaker couple who had sheltered Josiah in Maryland, discovered among her family's papers a small notebook containing the entry, "Man from Virginia," called Josiah Reed, 1847. She published excerpts of it in a local abolitionist newsletter, describing him as a figure who passed briefly through our keeping, but whose silence spoke volumes. That article, reprinted in the Christian Recorder, reached black readers across Pennsylvania and New Jersey, where former fugitives recognized fragments of his story. Letters began to arrive at Larimore's home from people who claimed descent from those Josiah had helped to freedom. Some wrote simply to say thank you. Others sent bits of information, dates, places, names of those who had once traveled under his guidance. Through these letters, a pattern emerged. One writer from Ontario recalled that her grandfather, a carpenter in St. Catharines, had been taught his trade by a man called Reed who said he'd learned to shape wood by escaping through it. Another, from upstate New York, claimed her great-grandfather had been guided north by a man matching Josiah's description. Whether all these accounts referred to the same person, or whether the name had become shorthand for courage mattered little. Together they formed a mosaic of remembrance. Josiah's life, once confined to a single plantation, had diffused across a continent, carried by those who refused to forget. In the 1890s, as the nation entered its Gilded Age, interest in the Underground Railroad revived among reformers seeking moral narratives to contrast the era's corruption. Historical societies began collecting testimonies, and some scholars interviewed the last surviving conductors and passengers of that hidden network. Among the materials gathered by the Pennsylvania Abolition Society was a worn wooden cross, said to have been found in an attic near York. On its back were the faint letters J.R. and a carved notch resembling a river's curve. No one could verify its origin, but one archivist noted, "It is said to have belonged to a man who crossed from bondage and returned for others." The cross became a small relic of freedom, displayed at exhibitions alongside iron shackles and manumission papers, a symbol of endurance that quietly resisted the sanitization of history. As the century turned, descendants of freed people began migrating northward in search of work, carrying their family stories with them. In cities like Pittsburgh, Detroit, and Chicago, oral traditions preserved the legacy of figures like Josiah. A 1903 WPA interviewer recorded the words of an elderly man named Thomas Brooks, who said, "My granddaddy told me of a man they called Reed, who stole hisself and made white folks afraid of silence. They say after he gone the fields wouldn't grow right, like the earth knew it lost something holy." Brooks's phrasing, half poetic, half testimonial, echoed the language of collective myth-making that had long replaced official archives. In the South, where segregation sought to erase black autonomy, these underground narratives became forms of quiet defiance. Teachers in black schools used them to teach moral lessons, framing the fugitives not as victims but as architects of their own deliverance. One educator in 1912 wrote in a curriculum guide for freedmen's schools, "Let the children know of the unnamed heroes whose feet wrote freedom across the land. Tell them of the man who fled by night and carried light in his hands." Though she never mentioned Josiah by name, her words carried his spirit. By the time of World War I, the physical traces of the old Virginia plantations had mostly disappeared. Yet when folklorists from the Library of Congress began recording African American songs and stories in the 1930s, Echoes of Josiah's legend resurfaced. In a recording from Caroline County dated 1937, an elderly woman sings a slow, mournful tune. River, take me. Like you took Reed, quiet my chains. Let the dogs not lead. When asked who Reed was, she replied, He the one that made the night safe. No more explanation followed. To her, his identity was self-evident, a cultural inheritance that required no proof. At the same time, academic historians began to re-examine the Underground Railroad with new rigor, poring over letters, runaway ads, and census records. In 1941, a young black historian at Howard University named Clara Jennings published an article titled The Silent Ones, Lost Voices of the Underground Railroad. Among the cases she cited was a fugitive named Josiah Reed, who escaped from Virginia in 1847 and whose name appears in multiple abolitionist correspondences. Jennings argued that such figures represented the moral center of the freedom struggle. They remind us that history is not only the record of who spoke, but of who refused to be silenced. Her essay became one of the first scholarly acknowledgments of Josiah's existence outside oral tradition. Through the 20th century, his story remained suspended between myth and history, a shape glimpsed through fog but never fully grasped. Yet each rediscovery deepened its resonance. In 1965, during the height of the Civil Rights Movement, a group of activists in Richmond founded the Reed Memorial Committee, dedicated to restoring neglected slave cemeteries and preserving the oral histories of the enslaved. They chose his name deliberately, not because they could prove every detail, but because he represented the unnamed multitude whose defiance made freedom possible. One of the committee's founders wrote in a local newspaper, "We claim Josiah Reed not as legend but as lineage. Every step we take toward justice walks in his footprints." Thus, by the century's end, Josiah's story, once whispered in fear, had become a symbol invoked in sermons, classrooms, and community gatherings. His name adorned a small historical marker near the Rappahannock River, erected in 1987 after local historians traced the remnants of the Reed Plantation. The plaque reads simply, "Here began the journey of Josiah Reed, whose escape in 1847 inspired generations to seek freedom. May silence never again hold dominion. For those who pass it, the river still runs quiet, as if holding its own memory of the night he crossed, the night he crossed." The forest had turned to ice by the time Josiah Reed reached the edges of Loudoun County. The last of the November wind carried a sharpened chill that cut into his bare hands and stiffened his breath into smoke. The ground, slick with half-frozen mud, swallowed each step with a quiet suction, as though even the earth itself wished to pull him back. But Josiah's pace never faltered. Every night since leaving Carter's plantation had been a war between exhaustion and will. Every sunrise was a danger, and every sunset was a narrow mercy. He had learned to rest in patches, beneath deadfall logs within abandoned tobacco barns or hidden near riverbanks where the mist kept him unseen. His mind had begun to drift between memory and instinct, but one thought always returned, grounding him with fierce clarity. Freedom was no longer an idea. It was a direction, north. In those final days before reaching safety, Josiah carried more than his body across the land. He carried the echo of a plantation that had begun to unravel in his absence. Back in Sussex County, the Reed quarters sat eerily quiet. The overseer, Matthew Harlan, had grown restless, his authority questioned after the failure to retrieve Josiah. Rumors spread that the slave patrols had found nothing but torn tracks and fragments of cloth. A whisper passed among the enslaved, "Josiah gone. Gone for good." The phrase moved through the cabins like a prayer and a challenge. The women spoke it while stirring cornmeal. The men repeated it under their breath when the overseer's back was turned. Silence became the new language of resistance, a mutiny expressed through the absence of fear. But the silence was not just among the enslaved. The Carter family, masters of the plantation for 3 generations, found their wealth thinning, their authority questioned by neighboring planters, who whispered about carelessness and weakness. To lose a man like Josiah, strong, skilled, obedient in appearance, was not merely an economic loss. It was a symbolic fracture. Edward Carter, the young heir who had inherited his father's estate, saw the escape as an omen. His father had built his fortune on the discipline of bodies. Now those same bodies carried his legacy away into the woods. By midwinter, tobacco yields had dropped, wagons went unmended, and the rhythm of plantation life faltered. The overseer's whip cracked more often, yet each blow only deepened the stillness. Meanwhile, Josiah's journey drew him closer to the Potomac River. There, in the fractured light of dawn, he met others whose names had been erased from ledgers, but not from the underground roots of freedom. A free black ferryman named Isaac, gray-haired and cautious, ferried him across the frigid waters in silence. Isaac's eyes had seen too many faces vanish into the current. He spoke little but offered a piece of cornbread wrapped in muslin and a single warning. Keep north till the stars tilt west. Then follow the moss. Beyond that crossing, the land grew colder, but the fear grew lighter. For the first time since his escape, Josiah began to walk upright, no longer crawling through brush or kneeling before shadows. Word of Josiah's passage began to move along networks invisible to the white south. Quilts appeared on fences. Barns bore subtle chalk marks, and certain candles burned longer in cabin windows. The Underground Railroad was not yet a single organization in 1847, but rather a loose web of courage, a system written in the gestures of the poor and the brave. In Winchester, an elderly woman known only as Aunt Millie let Josiah rest in her cellar for 2 days, tending the wounds on his feet with lard and tobacco leaves. She spoke of others who had passed through, a woman from Norfolk who carried her child in a flour sack, a boy from Richmond who never made it beyond the Rappahannock. She said Josiah's silence reminded her of them, that deep, heavy silence of men who had seen too much and spoken too little. Back on the Reed plantation, the silence had begun to rot into unease. Overseer Harlan's patrols intensified, but his men found more sabotage than fugitives. Tools disappeared. Mules were let loose in the night. Barrels of tobacco mysteriously burned. The enslaved refused to speak of it, but among themselves they said Josiah's spirit was walking. In the quarters they told stories by firelight, that he had crossed into the free states and turned into wind, that his shadow returned at night to whisper courage into the weak. To the Carters these whispers were superstition. To the enslaved they were prophecy. As winter waned, Josiah reached Maryland's borderlands, where the air smelled faintly of salt and pine. Here the danger grew sharper, for the slave catchers operated with the precision of hunters. Yet Josiah had grown wise to the sounds of pursuit, the baying of hounds, the creak of saddle leather, the crack of branches under heavy boots. He learned to double back across streams, to mask his scent with mud, and to walk backward in his own tracks. One night, while hiding in a hollow tree near Hagerstown, he overheard 2 bounty men speaking. One mentioned Carter's name, the reward, and the shame it had brought upon the family. The plantation's curse now, one had said. Workers gone mad, fields gone fallow. Ain't no discipline left since that nigger vanished. Josiah felt a strange calm hearing it. For the first time he realized his flight had not just saved him, it had wounded the system that had tried to own him. By early spring, Josiah's path intersected with Quakers near Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. They clothed him in coarse wool, gave him a new name, Samuel Day, and introduced him to the concept of legal freedom. Yet freedom, as Josiah quickly learned, carried its own silence. He could not write letters to those left behind, nor speak his true name in public. He worked in fields again, but this time for wages. The scent of tobacco or the crack of a whip from a distant farm would sometimes send him reeling back into memory. He understood then that the body can flee long before the soul catches up. Still, every sunrise brought a gentler light, one that did not belong to masters. The Reed plantation never recovered. In 1848, a fever swept through the quarters, killing several field hands and the overseer himself. Edward Carter sold off parcels of land to cover debts, eventually abandoning the manor to distant cousins. The great house, once filled with the noise of industry and control, fell into a decay that mirrored the old world's decline. Vines grew over the veranda. The fields turned to wild grass. Locals began calling it the silent plantation. Some said at night they could hear singing from the overgrown fields, a sound like chains breaking underwater. Josiah, now Samuel, lived to see the first stirrings of organized abolition in the North. He attended meetings in small wooden churches where men and women read aloud the stories of fugitives, recording names and dates, preserving what had once been erased. When he heard his own story told, distorted, half-guessed, yet alive, he wept quietly. He did not correct them. The details mattered less than the endurance. To exist as a story was a second kind of freedom. Years later, when the Civil War began, Samuel Reed, as he called himself then, joined the Union ranks as a laborer. He marched through Virginia once more, passing the same rivers and hills that had once hidden him. In 1864, near Petersburg, he paused by a ruined estate half swallowed by ivy. Locals told him it had been a Carter plantation long ago, now abandoned. Standing before its shattered porch, Samuel closed his eyes. He could almost hear the rustle of the fields, the low hum of workers' songs, the distant thud of boots on red soil. But the air was still. The silence that had once been terror now felt sacred. It was the silence of completion, of a world ending so another could begin. That night, as the campfires flickered under a bruised sky, Samuel took from his pocket a small object wrapped in cloth, a fragment of the iron shackle he had broken during his escape. He buried it beneath an oak tree, pressing the soil flat with his palm. "So the ground remembers," he murmured. Around him the forest whispered softly, not in fear but in peace. Somewhere beyond, the wind carried the faintest trace of a song that no overseer could ever silence again. And in that forgotten corner of Virginia, the plantation that once measured worth in human bondage lay forever quiet, its silence not of absence, but of deliverance, a land that had fallen mute so that one man's name could live, whispered through generations as both warning and prayer. Josiah Reed, who walked through darkness until the world itself went still to let him pass, still to let him pass.